Good evening and welcome to Understanding the Roots of Racism, Career Building. At this point, I'd like to welcome United Way of Central Indiana President and CEO, Ann Mertlow.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this 9th session of our series, Understanding the Roots of Racism. Our first 8 sessions covered the topics of health, housing, food insecurity, transportation, education, financial success, social capital and civic engagement, and mental health. Tonight, our panel is addressing the intersections of personal and cultural identities with professional growth and career opportunities for Black Americans. We're here tonight because United Way is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do in our community. We acknowledge that to move forward in our journey as an organization, we must first understand the roots of the problem so together we can tackle and overcome systems that grow and perpetuate racial inequity in our community. Despite the small yet significant signs of progress and accountability we're beginning to witness, United Way recognizes that we still have a long way to go and is committed to the hard and honest work it will take to make Central Indiana a more fair and equitable place to live for all who call it home. Also, given that this is the first public event we have hosted since the tragic shooting at FedEx, I want to take a moment to offer my heartfelt condolences on behalf of the entire United Way family to all those grieving the loss of a loved one, and send peace and comfort to the family members, friends, and colleagues still working to process the impact of this senseless act of violence. A member of the United Way family who is also a member of the local Sikh community was affected in this incident. Please know that we stand with you in solidarity and are here to support and uplift you in every way we can. Finally, I want to thank the thousands of you who have logged on to join us for these discussions over the last 8 months. Thank you for sticking with us and bringing your enthusiasm, passion, and even at times advice for how we can continue to live up to our shared values. If you have missed any of these sessions, please remember they're still available to view on our YouTube page or website at uwci.org. Know that I too am here to continue learning. So upon the start of the discussion, I'll be disappearing from the screen and listening alongside you at home. And now I'm thrilled to introduce you to the moderator for this session this evening, Sam Odle. Sam is a senior policy advisor at Bose Public Affairs Group, a longtime United Way board member, and someone I value as a personal friend. I'm incredibly grateful he volunteered to moderate what is certain to be an enlightening and engaging conversation. Sam, thank you again for your leadership. The virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Ann. I'm thrilled and honored to be here as our moderator tonight. Nearly 60 years have passed since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal for employers to racially discriminate in the workplace. However, data clearly shows how racism continues to impact the career development and the advancement for Black Americans in today's workforce. I'm looking forward to leading this discussion with our panel of community leaders to examine the intersection of personal and cultural identities with professional growth and career opportunities for Black professionals. Together, we'll find out how Central Indiana employers are promoting real advances in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and address who carries the primary responsibility for making these changes. It is our hope that upon the conclusion of this panel, you too will feel inspired to take positive steps to better yourself and our community. Tonight, we have an opportunity to learn from experts and community leaders who regularly inspire change right here in Central Indiana. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's accomplished panel. We'll start with Camille Blount, the Director of Public Affairs at Taft, Stenius & Hollister, LLP. Next, I'll introduce Reverend Rodney Francis, the Chief Programs Officer at Employ Indy. Next, we have Dr. Sean Huddleston, the President of Martin University. At this time, I'll also welcome Dr. Leon Jackson, the Executive Director of Strategic Initiatives at Marian University. I'm also excited to welcome Carolyn Mosby, the President and CEO of Mid-States Minority Supplier Development Council. And last but not least, Denisha Posey, the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging at Ivy Tech. Now that you've met our panel, I'd like to go ahead and open the discussion with our first question. A recent study conducted from 2017 to 2019 by PayScale found Black men earned 87 cents for every dollar a white man earned. This same study also concluded that even as these men climb the corporate ladder, they still make less than equally qualified white men. In fact, they are the only racial ethnic group that does not achieve pay parity with white men at some level. The statistics are even more damning for Black women. Think about this. A National Women's Law Center survey showed that even occupation does not explain away the wage gap. For example, Black women working as physicians and surgeons, a traditionally male high-wage occupation, make 54 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men working as physicians and surgeons. How is this still the case in 2021? And what can be done to fix it? Denisha, I'd like for you to lead us off in responding to that question.
All right. Thank you for having us. This is going to be a tremendous conversation. I'm really excited about this. But the short answer to your question is systemic and institutionalized racism. While racism and sexism are often thought of as individual biases, history shows us that systemic discrimination in pay based on race, class, gender, and even immigration status can be traced all the way back to the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, the mass execution of Native communities, and government-funded and supported segregation, and so on and so forth. The wages of Black women in particular are driven down by a number of current factors, including gender and racial discrimination and those intersections, workplace harassment, job segregation, and a lack of workplace policies that support family caregiving, which is still most performed by women. Almost 80% of Black mothers are key breadwinners for their families, which means their households rely heavily on their wages to make ends meet and to get ahead. But what we also know is that Black women enroll in college at higher rates than men overall, and most notably at higher rates than white men. But the pay gap is largest for Black women who have bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees. Those Black women making only 35%, were making 35% less than white men on average. So we often hear the misconception that Black women or women in general don't ask for promotions at the same rate as white men or men in general, right? That might be a reason why Black women don't make enough money or make equal money. That is a misconception. Black women ask for promotions and raises at about the same rates as white women and men, yet they are still held back at that first critical step up to manager. So for every 100 men promoted as manager, only 58 Black women are promoted. And finally, as we think about the current coronavirus pandemic, it has exacerbated these deep, long-standing biases against Black women that are built deeply entrenched into our systems. Beyond the pay gap, Black women are shouldering more responsibility at home with less financial security. And according to research from leanin.org and SurveyMonkey, Black women are almost twice as likely as white men to say that they've been laid off, furloughed, or had hours or their pay reduced because of COVID-19. So your next question was, what can we do to fix this? There's a simple answer to that as well. Pay Black women. I see in the audience right now that I have a previous employer, actually my first employer right out of law school, and still a current mentor, Fatima Johnson, in the audience. And I just want to shout her out because she intentionally decided to pay me beyond my worth, really, as a brand new baby lawyer. I had an 8-month-old baby and I was 6 months pregnant at the time with my second. She decided that she was going to pay me my worth. And since then, I haven't looked back. Companies need to create those intentional policies and structures to ensure pay equity at all levels. So what are we seeing as a result of this? We're finding companies that are doing equity reviews, and particularly annual equity audits. Google, for example, uses an annual pay equity review by which they run a rigorous statistical analysis to ensure salaries and bonuses are fair. They take into account your role, your level, your location, and your performance. And if they find any differences in proposed pay between men and women or by race and ethnicity, they make those upward adjustments.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it does point out you have to be deliberate in solving for some of these historical and systemic problems. It's critical also to note that there's a big difference between diversity and inclusion. Black employees deserve to not only be in the room, not only be at the table, but also contribute to the decision-making process of an organization, whether it's around pay, policies, or other issues. As of last year, Black people made up 0.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs. Data shows that 10% of all college graduates are Black, yet less than 1% lead our largest companies. Why is that? Carolyn, can you comment on that?
Absolutely. There's a lot that we can talk about in response to the why. And when you think about the fact that by the year 2045, Brown and Black people will be the majority in this country, and the fact that last year in 2020, children of color were the majority among youth in the United States, there has to be a shift in the mindset and the actions of those that sit in the seats of privilege in corporate America. When you think about climbing that corporate ladder and having a seat at the table, a lot of those opportunities are based on relationships. And many of the C-suite jobs are already decided long before they're ever posted, or if they're ever posted. Many people of color simply don't have those relationships in corporate America that lead to the C-suite opportunities. And even for those that do, they're typically offered positions that don't come with the significant P&L experience and responsibility that ultimately leads to becoming a CEO. And I think the other thing is that change has to come from the top. So if your corporate board of directors and the CEO don't value diversity in a way that drives change and opportunities for people of color, and if they're not willing to step outside of their comfort zone and be uncomfortable and have those uncomfortable conversations and expand their circle, it's just not going to happen. And the final thing that I'll say is that, we have some responsibility too, because we have to show up ready for those opportunities. And when you think about economic impact and the fact that we buy a lot of the products and enlist the services of many of those corporations that don't hire and promote us, our Black dollar is significant. The power of it is significant. And history has definitely shown us that we yield significant economic influence and power that's only going to increase with the browning of America. I'll give a simple example. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. I was born in the late 60s, and we had white flight, and that happened after we elected our first Black mayor. And so, as a kid, I grew up not really being able to enjoy a lot of the things that my friends enjoyed, because we would not, as a family, support those businesses that chose to move out of our city to Maryville, Indiana, which was created by the white flight. And so we took the position that we were going to support our community. And so I think we also have to look at the economic power that we have, and outside of corporate America, if we take more of a stance and understand how powerful our dollars are, and mobilize to ensure that those corporations are providing those opportunities for us to advance within their organization if they still want us to purchase from them.
Great, thank you. Dr. Huddleston,
yeah.
Can you add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so in addition to that, I think that we have to make sure that we are also walking the walk. Right. I think that it's important and imperative, quite frankly, for African Americans and others who have been pushed to the margins to make sure that we are lifting each other from those margins and more to the front by supporting each other, right? And so we have many institutions and establishments that are led by people of color that need our support, but oftentimes we don't necessarily support them in the way that we should. So I think it's imperative that if we have that expectation, particularly among our white brothers and sisters, that we should also have that same expectation amongst ourselves.
Right. Thank you. So there's something to be done on both sides. You know, the white people that are in influence have a role to play, but we as minorities, brown and black people, we have a role to play as well. Okay, thank you very much. A University of Chicago survey found 65% of black professionals thought it was harder for black employees to advance in the workplace. At the same time, whites, only 16% of white professionals agreed with the statement. What do with that statement that it's harder to advance? So 64% of blacks felt it was hard to advance. Only 16% of whites felt it was hard for blacks to advance. So you've got a real dichotomy there. What do our white colleagues need to learn about our experiences in the workplace that they maybe are not experiencing? Camille?
Well, I think with this question, you really have to, as a white colleague, I think that it's important that when you see a black colleague being treated unfairly, that you speak up and say something, that you don't just continue to let that happen. I think a lot of times there are inequities in the workplace. People are very much aware of those, but they never say anything and they continue to let it happen. Also, I think that our white colleagues need to hold black people to the same standards as others. A lot of times we are held to a higher standard. We are not allowed or given grace to make mistakes, where our white colleagues are allowed to make mistakes, and they're not looked down upon as a black person in the workplace is. So we should be held to the same standards that they are, and then allowed to grow and allowed to really have opportunity to work on things, to have new experiences, and just be treated fairly and you know, allowed to spread our wings and grow as our white colleagues are. A lot of times you will see individuals promoted over, especially me as a black female, you will see individuals promoted over you that have no experience, they may have less education, and literally you can't understand or make sense of this. And that can't continue to happen in the society that we live in if we want to see things change.
Yeah.
And someone has to speak up for that.
Yeah, I'd open that up for any of the other panel members that may have an experience as you all have gone through your careers where you felt the level of difficulty may have been more difficult for you than it was for white colleagues that you were interacting with. Anybody want to comment on that? Leon?
I'll comment. Thanks again for the opportunity to participate. You know, one of the biggest challenges is kind of being invited in. And one of the things that we also have to do is make ourselves available to be included in some of these, you know, things that are happening. For instance, I didn't golf. And when I went to and got my MBA, all of my classmates would go out and golf and say, you know, come on, Leon. And I eliminated myself from a lot of these conversations and these opportunities to build relationships with them because that wasn't what I was into. And so rather than going and golfing with them, I'd go and, you know, eat out with, you know, go to a restaurant or whatever the case. And so, you know, in that experience, I really realized how often I remove myself from the opportunity to grow and learn. And so as soon as I completed my program, I said, you know what, I'm going to pick up golf. And, you know, I'm not very good. So anybody out there who wants to play, I'm sure you can beat me. But the important thing was that now, not only am I willing, I showed myself willing to step out and be invited into a space that I'm not normally comfortable. The same thing for other, you know, for coworkers and things of that nature. I had to step out of my comfort zone and only hanging out and talking to the people that I felt comfortable with and I knew, because in that I saw people getting promotions and things like that from side conversations and getting invited into opportunities from side conversations, getting invited to do different things and try different things over lunch. You know, my colleagues would go to lunch and they would say, hey, you want to come to, you know, this restaurant I've never heard of and probably won't like the food from. And I would say, no, I'll just, you know, go over here. But when I started to say yes, I began to find myself in some conversations that I normally would not have found myself. So part of it is just stepping out of your comfort zone and being willing to engage in things and try new things, because again, that's where a lot of opportunities are presented in those informal gatherings. And so you don't want to miss out on those kinds of opportunities for sure.
Sam, if I could just add one thing, because and this is from some of my own personal experiences, that oftentimes in the workplace, I think that it's assumed that opportunities are being presented to Black employees that have nothing to do with career advancement or promotion, right? So you get invited to be on the committee and to sit in the meeting, but you're not necessarily invited to lead the committee unless the committee has something to do with issues that affect Black employees, right? And so if the question is, what can white colleagues do to assist, is to think about those career advancing opportunities that don't always include Black people, not just every opportunity, but the career advancing opportunities that don't always include Black people. I think that is one of kind of a lesson for all of us.
And Sam, if I can add to what Dr. Huddleston and Dr. Jackson have said, you know, I think it's, you know, I've had the same experiences as Dr. Jackson. You do have to make yourself open and develop to move into spaces you're not comfortable. But at the same time, we need the white community, corporations, those who are responsible for running those organizations, to accept that ownership as well. That I shouldn't have to. If I don't like playing golf, I shouldn't have to play golf. Whatever happened to meritocracy? Whatever happened to my performance? Whatever happened to me being invited into those conversations because of what I can contribute? So I shouldn't have to be pulled out of my comfort space to a space where I am completely not known. I had to go take a golf etiquette class at the local community college, Golf 101, in order to make sure that when I stepped on the greens, I didn't make a complete, you know, so-and-so of myself. I don't know how many of them had to do that to go take a basketball 101 course to have a conversation with me. So I think that corporations have some responsibility to ensuring that those kinds of conversations and those kinds of sidebar activities that are happening where the sort decisions are being made because someone moving to and maybe for company needs to not happen, but that we are looking at people and what they offer and value their contribution, and those spaces, conversations for elevation are being had in the professional spaces as they should. And so I wanted to say that I want to harken back something to Denisha posed. She in the question that she answered around the intersection of race and sexuality, gender, and she made a brilliant point, and I thank her for her comments about how Black women are not treated fairly with regards to men. And I want to be clear to say that is white men. That is not Black men. Black men are not running those institutions. Black men are not making those choices and decisions. So I want to be clear that, yeah, those things exist. But when we hear those conversations, I feel all the time that we kind of Black men feel like they're being lumped into that larger conversation. And it's not necessarily so, because there's not enough of us sitting in those positions of influence and decision-making to make that much of a factor.
Can I jump in real quick? I would like to say there's not enough, but there are some. And we have to also be our biggest advocates and our biggest supporters. And, you know, in moving back to Indianapolis from Las Vegas, I found it very difficult to connect with, especially those individuals who are in positions of authority and influence, even in our community, and felt that I had to go outside of our community to really get exposure and introductions into to conversations that you would expect your Black mentors and Black individuals to help you into. And so I found it very, very difficult to go the way of engaging with individuals of color who are ahead of me and above me in different roles. It was like they shut the door in my face, and I had to go somewhere else to get the exposure. Not until I got somebody else's sign off or approval who didn't look like us did I get accepted by the larger that individual or the larger group. And so we have to also do a better job of supporting one another and inviting each other into these rooms where we're not the majority. If you have friends who are active in the community, let's get on boards and things like that. Invite them to participate in different things. Again, the I don't know if you want to call them Black establishment, because I don't know if that's a thing here, right? But we do have people who are in some of those rooms, and they're not inviting people in either. And so we have to make sure that we have to hold those individuals accountable as well, because they've been given unique access. And so there are some who have that access, and those individuals should be looking to open that funnel up, rather than kind of cutting it off and saying, there's only room at the top for one or a few of us.
I think that, the systemic racism part of it, I think that we all are aware of, is that a lot of times people feel like, well, there is only going to be one, or that, well, I was lucky I got in and I'm not going to rock the boat and, make it difficult. And so that's buried in that whole systemic roots of racism that we all have a responsibility to try to break down. And I think that, again, we have a responsibility, but then our white colleagues have to understand that, don't make us feel like we're going to be the only one in the room. Don't make us feel like we're an exception, because we can all achieve given the opportunity. I want to move on to another important question, though. While the U.S. Supreme Court ruled more than 65 years ago that states could not prevent Black students from attending the same schools as whites or higher education systems, our higher education systems still have many barriers in existence, from entry to completion for students of color. Can you share some of those obstacles and what's being done to dismantle them? Dr. Huddleston, you want to lead off?
Yeah, and I want to also invite my higher ed colleagues, Dr. Jackson and Vice President Posey, to weigh in on this at all. But talk about the roots of racism, right? I mean, this is the crux of where it all happened. If you think back, Black people in the United States, lives were in jeopardy and their freedom was in jeopardy if they simply became educated, right? So education has been a lightning rod for racism since we landed on these shores. So with that, what some of the outcome has been around that relative to the obstacles has been the development of different types of institutions to make sure that the obstacles are removed, barriers are removed, right? And so we have minority serving institutions. Many are familiar with HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. There's also predominantly Black colleges, which is essentially an HBCU that was founded after the year 1964. Federal government says you can't call yourself an HBCU, but there's also Hispanic serving institutions, other types of institutions. So we really kind of organized ourselves around education for access, right? To help to remove the barriers and help to move to completion. But our institutions are under-resourced. Some of that certainly is by design. The systems and structures of higher education in the entire country restrict the resources that go to our institutions. So it makes it much harder for us to attract and recruit and retain and support and graduate the students who we are supporting. Now, there has been recent legislation, certainly under the Obama administration, and moving forward, there's been a lot of legislation that has increased the level of federal resources that go to institutions. But if you take private institutions, many of the minority serving institutions are private institutions who don't always have access to federal dollars and rely on grants and gifts and sponsorships and other things that come from the corporate community and other large entities and foundations, then the support is not equal there. And so that creates the different challenges that can come for our students from just the overall how our institutions are resourced to be able to support students. I'd say a second thing is what I refer to as the first generation phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that most minority serving institutions educate more first generation students. That is a student who does not have a family member who attended college before they did. We educate more to the tune of about 53% than predominantly white institutions. So as we know that oftentimes when someone who is from an underserved or under-resourced community comes to college, the family comes with them because they haven't had the experience before, right? And so the idea of how we might be able to make sure that it does become an experience that can extend through the family and become a multi-generational experience can happen a couple of different ways. Schools like Martin University, for example, we have always focused on the non-traditional age student. We were founded to try to address that first generation problem by making sure that the parents and the caregivers and the elders in the community also had a higher education experience so that they could be the ones to inspire and support the kids coming out of high school to go to college and stay in college, right? And so I think addressing that first generation phenomenon by making sure that there is some level of experience within the families and the communities around higher education is important. But in addition to that, it is also about making sure that how we wrap around and support our students and their unique journeys is also taken into account. And it's not just about making sure that they get the college degree. The end result should not be just walking across a stage. The end result should be walking across the stage and into whatever dream you decide. The third thing I would say, and then I'll defer to my colleagues, is I think higher education across the board, and certainly including minority serving institutions, really need to do a better job on delivering on the promise. At the end of the day, absolutely, we want to make sure that people get that college degree, but the promise is that if you get a college degree, it is the gateway to a better life, to a different life, right? To better opportunities. That's what we say. And so oftentimes people are making that investment with money that they don't have to invest. They're taking out debt that they have no idea how they're going to pay back. And so they need some way to be able to make sure that they have a return on that investment. How do we get there? We have to do it through partnering with the folks who are either going to make our students or graduates great employees or great employers, right? It shouldn't just be about walking into a job. It should also be about walking into the business that you always dreamed about owning, right? So entrepreneurship needs to be on the table. But our corporate partners, our employer partners need to take active measures to hire our students and hire them to do work in their companies with the businesses that they have started, right? Now, I think someone mentioned earlier, it may have been Carolyn, I'm sorry, it's been so many great comments from our panelists, it's hard for me to keep up, but, or it might have been even you, Sam, that those employers need to have sustainable diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. They need to have ways for when our students land into their businesses, that there's a career trajectory that could land them in the C-suite or even in the board, right? So inclusion and equity is important in order to take advantage of the diversity that they keep saying that they so desperately want and need. So I'll end there and certainly defer to Denisha and to Dr. Jackson on any additional comments that you want to add.
Sure, if I may. So I teach a course at IU McKinney School of Law called Race in the Law. I'm fascinated by how race, law, policy, all of that interjects. So I'll just do a quick little, if you just don't mind me for a second, I just want to give a quick little history on Indianapolis. So Indianapolis, we can trace most of our current education outcomes to the creation of UniGov back in the 1970s, right? So the idea was to put a bigger, more powerful Indianapolis on the national map. We were simplifying our city services and growing the city's tax base. Indianapolis wasn't the only city at the time to merge with the surrounding counties, but we were the only city to explicitly leave schools out of the deal. So with that, Black and Brown students were hyper concentrated here in Center Township and left the other 11 townships very homogeneously white and very more resourced. So what we find today as a result of the systemic racism and segregation is that our Black and our Brown students, like Dr. Huddleston mentioned, being under-resourced, but also criminalized, overly disciplined, and disproportionately diagnosed with mental and emotional health disorders at very young ages. We're talking about our preschoolers. So what can we do at in the higher education field? At Ivy Tech, we're the largest post-secondary institution in the state, but we're also home to 52% of all Black students who are degree-seeking post-secondary students within a state. So we have a tremendous responsibility and obligation to ensure that all of our students, that we're leading the effort to ensure that all of our students are prepared for Indiana's workforce and that they have the skills needed to be competitive and meet those needs of the employers. And we cannot do that without being hyperly intentional about our Black students, particularly our Black male students, in eliminating those barriers imposed upon them before they even walk in the doors at Ivy Tech. So disaggregating our data, looking at our students from enrollment to retention to completion by race, also disaggregating our employee data. How many Black and Brown faculty and administrative leaders do we have? And how are we being intentional about changing those dynamics? Those are critical conversations that we're having at Ivy Tech. But additionally, we have to work with our K-12 partners. There has to be tremendous synergy between K-12 and higher education to ensure that more students have access to what we have as dual credit or dual enrolled classes while they're still in high school. So with Ivy Tech, our courses are free. Students can leave high school with an associate's degree with absolutely zero cost. More students of color need to have access to this, right? If I'm telling you this, we have 65,000 students across the state of Indiana that have some sort of dual credit with Ivy Tech. That's not nearly enough, especially if these classes are free. We also have many adult learners, and we also know that the needs for those learners are different from our traditional age students, right? So Dr. Huddleston also mentioned those wraparound services. We need to ensure that we are eliminating and knocking down any barriers that our students face. So if you need assistance with childcare, we will pay for it. If you are behind on your bills and you just can't go to class because your lights are turned off, we will pay your bill. If you caught a flat tire on your way to class and now you need to miss class or drop out, we will pay for you to get your flat tire fixed, right? We need to ensure that we're meeting our students where they're at and they're getting everything that they need. In addition to that, we have a tremendous partnership with Dr. Huddleston at Martin, tons of other four-year institutions to ensure that the associate's degree that folks are earning at Ivy Tech can transfer seamlessly to those four-year institutions. And then also ensuring that we're working with community and faith-based organizations that are knee deep in the community, that have the trust of the community in order to help us get our message out there.
It seems like that, for many of those students too, they need to be able to work and go to school. That's kind of a barrier. So we really need employers to provide part-time jobs and to help students who are going through the educational system to be able to support themselves while they're getting educated, especially when they're coming from economically distressed families. The other thing is we got more minorities being educated, but affirmative action was a major contributing factor towards the gains and strides made by Blacks in education, employment, business, etc. during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. However, the subsequent reduction and erosion of those gains with the dismantling and weakening of affirmative action during the mid-90s up until this modern era raises the question if it is now necessary for such a national program to be reconsidered to address the glaring gaps between Blacks and whites in the workplace. Rodney, you want to comment on that?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, that's a very good question and timely one, I think, for us to consider when we talk about the roots of racism where we are. So, yes, I think so. I think the data would definitely suggest so, right? I was recently looking at a study by the Harvard and Kennedy School that stated, and I quote, "Ending affirmative action programs significantly decreased diversity in the workplace." So I think that, the research is clear that affirmative action during this, 30 years of effectiveness contributed greatly to what we saw as the largest mass advancement of Black Americans in education, employment, and business, and therefore into the middle class over a short period of time. In fact, it was so effective in its claims and in its aims at closing the desperate gaps between Black and white Americans that during that period, that it came under intense political assault and received much pushback from white Americans during the late 80s and 90s, which, as you have already mentioned, resulted in the weakening and rendering affirmative action as a remedy ineffective. So consequently, we have what we see today as a reversal of those gains by Black Americans in all the aforementioned areas, to include the middle class, since this dismantling. I mean, the gaps we see today between Black and white Americans were intentional and systemic. So, I think it stands to reason to suggest that to undo those gaps, it would take the same level of intentionality and systemic response, of which affirmative action or a similarly aimed program should be considered. So Sam, I also found it interesting that there is a resurgence of conversation around the corridors of Washington, D.C. around reparations for Black Americans for the 400+ years of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and the like. I do believe that an affirmative action type program could and should be a part of that overall conversation. Also, I want to point out that another aim of affirmative action that went into place back in the 60s, along with the closing of the gap between white and Black Americans, was to also close the gap in cultural awareness through proximity, right? Through proximity via housing and education and employment, that the more we got to know each other, the more we get to understand each other and close these kinds of gaps, right? To kind of change white attitudes and perhaps even hearts towards Black Americans. I find it interesting that since the dismantling of affirmative action and a move away from its goals, we've seen a complete reversal of this, as the data demonstrates that we are just as segregated in these areas now as we were during the 60s, if not even more. What affirmative action was not able to do in changing white attitudes and hearts towards Black Americans, it was able to close the gaps and increase the gains for Black Americans. So, quite frankly, and this might be a little bit provocative and many can think it's so, I'm less concerned with trying to change attitudes and hearts of white Americans than I am with policies and programs that will result in closing the desperate and debilitating gaps we see between white and Black Americans. So yes, I think something is definitely needed.
I think we could all find or reflect back on examples of where we were helped in our careers by having a relation, may have been helped by affirmative action, but many times it was relationships, that we had relationships with a white colleague or white boss or white mentor, or someone who really helped us. And we know that economic outcomes and professional advancement are greatly influenced by social networking and career mentoring. What is being done in Central Indiana to infuse equity in career development programming and mentoring that will sort of replace maybe or shore up what we lost with the lack of affirmative action? Carolyn, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think we've seen a lot of programs and initiatives that have either grown or been created over the last several years in Central Indiana. Interestingly enough, I don't know now, it's probably been 12 years ago, I worked for a global organization where ironically, I was the first Black executive in the 100-year history of the organization. But they did a great job of creating programming in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, where they started to build their pipeline of leaders. And they started to infuse those principles and practices that these kids needed to know and have in order to understand the importance of social networking and career development and mentoring. And the goal was, after moving them through all of these programs and they graduate from college, they then return to the community, equipped to be able to enter into corporate America and already having established relationships and really understanding the art of networking and career development. I think everyone here is familiar with the Center for Leadership Development. That's one of my favorite organizations. They do such an amazing job working with our youth. My son is actually going through that program now. But I think it's important that as we look at some of these programs and initiatives, and I have to say, and there's probably a whole lot of people on this call that can point directly to Mr. Sam Odle for being someone who has helped to facilitate career development and helping us get connected in the community and be aware of opportunities and to get our foot in the door to have those important conversations that we may not have been able to have. And so us as professionals have a responsibility. And I think all of us in our roles and responsibilities as leaders can probably say, based on some of the things that we've experienced where the doors weren't open, and to Dr. Jackson's point, we should feel responsible and have a responsibility to help those other individuals. But, as I thought about other programs, in addition to the Center for Leadership Development, in state government, I know there's an African-American state employees group that actually was started when I worked there back in 1990. So where you have colleagues within state government that support each other. The professional organizations that we have here, the Black MBA Association, the Urban League Young Professionals, which I'm sure Camille can speak to as well. But then those other programs that may not be African-American specific, but where we have the opportunity to participate, like the Stanley K. Lacey program, this Pass the Torch for Women program, the Tobias Leadership program. And to be honest with you, we probably need to be more visible and participate more in those programs, because as we've talked about, privilege, where we're not in those seats and part of those conversations, a lot of those individuals are white counterparts that are going through those same programs. That's the opportunity for us to develop those relationships there as well that can help us as we journey on our career, on our career journey as well. So I'll leave it there and invite my other colleagues to join in.
Real quick, I'll add to that, Carolyn. But let me step back and talk about some of the things that we're doing at Marion for diversity, especially as it pertains to higher ed. We have, when I was first brought on to the education program, the Fred S. Clips Educators College, we had about 7.5% students of color in the education program. My job was to get us to 40%. And in 1 year, we went from 7.5%, which is what you'll typically see, to almost 32% students of color. We went from about an average GPA of about a 3.0 to average 3.75. Average SAT score went up about a couple hundred points. And so at Marion, we also have, it's been rated the most diverse school of business in the Midwest. So we're doing some really cool things. And lastly, let me say about a program we're getting ready to launch, the Diversity and Leadership Program, which is really intended to increase the number of ethnic minorities who are in the executive suite here in Indianapolis. And we're doing that through several courses, but also we've invited IU, Purdue, Notre Dame, and Butler to participate, to where now we're getting individuals who are that mid-level professional who's looking for that next step, an opportunity to grow and take on projects that allow them to grow. Because typically what our opportunities look like is a car that's on fire with no steering wheel and no tires. And this program is designed to wrap the context of learning around these projects so that even if things don't go as they had planned, you have what we call the direction, protection, and order in order to allow someone who is not typically thrust into leadership opportunities the grace to grow, along with opportunities to persist into any of these universities' MBA programs. The other thing I wanted to say is about affirmative action, and understanding that affirmative action has worked. It's worked for white women. That's who's been the biggest beneficiary of affirmative action. So I think Rodney mentioned the policies that need to change. Affirmative action wasn't broken. Who they targeted in those efforts was wrong or broken, or they were included as well, but we were not promoted in at the same rate. So let me get back to the question here. Again, the diversity in leadership is a program that we're very excited about here at Marion. And we've been very intentional about inviting those other institutions in to collaborate with us, where the individuals who complete this diversity and leadership program, it's a 6-month program, they're able to matriculate with direct admits, no MBA, no GMAT, no GRE requirements into the University of Notre Dame, into Butler University, into IU, Kelley School of Business, into Cranard. This is a huge barrier to us getting into some of those great opportunities because we're scared of this test, right? We don't want to go back and sit in these seats in some instances. And so what we're trying to do is alleviate some of those pain points through this program and really help skill up some of our most talented individuals who feel like they have to leave Indianapolis in order to find real opportunity. And so this program, Diversity and Leadership, will be launching here really soon. I'll be sure to share the information with everyone on the call.
Right, I think
I'm sorry.
I was saying it's a good example of capturing those mid-careers, giving them additional skills so they're more attracted to employers and recognized and moved up. I'd like to get Camille's perspective on the issue of mentoring and how important that is in the workplace. Since we don't have affirmative action, we've got to depend on white mentors helping, to create those opportunities. What experiences have you had, and what do you think needs to be done to increase the number of mentoring activities?
Well, I just think that for me in my professional career, it definitely took me networking outside of my comfort zone in order to advance. So as many people on the call may know, I'm returning to the lobbying world. And lobbying, there are very few people who look like me in the hallways of our state house. And so it can be very intimidating. So I definitely had to, step outside of what I was accustomed to and what I'm used to in order to be successful in my career. So I, it took a colleague believing in me to allow me to work on his clients, to allow me to grow, but not only that, sharing billing credit with me on that client, because that's the piece that's missing is they'll allow us to work on their clients, but we won't get the financial gain from that client. So when this, again, as I spoke earlier about white colleagues speaking up when there are injustices, that's what happened to me as a professional. And that's how I grew. And that's how I was able to gain confidence in myself as a professional. And that's half of our battle a lot of times, is not even believing that we belong at the table. So really believing in yourself that, okay, you kind of get to the table and then you're afraid to say anything. So you have to be sometimes the voice of the voiceless, and offer those opinions that may not always be pleasant for people to hear. But if we don't speak up for people who look like us, if we don't bring someone else along that looks like us, how can we expect them to do it? So I think, I personally spend a lot of time meeting with young professionals. They talk about the young professionals group with the Urban League. I know Denisha is a part of that. My sister is also on the executive committee of that group. And that's been a great opportunity, I think, for young minorities to get involved and begin that networking, getting comfortable with networking with each other, so then they can step outside of that to network with others. And so I think that networking is not easy for a lot of people. And it's hard to step outside of your, as we talk about, your comfort zone, and be able to strike up conversation with people who are not like you. You don't have a lot in common with them. You're not interested in the same things that they're interested in. But if you don't put yourself in those rooms for people to know who you are, you won't be suggested to be on boards. A lot of these boards are now looking for individuals of color to be on their boards to offer a different voice. But if they've never seen your face before, you won't be in the list of recommendations to be present. And so we have to do, we can't just network with each other. We have to step outside of that and be present and be seen, and not be afraid to speak up and talk to people. So that's kind of been my experience. It's worked for me. I'm also a person who is willing to meet with people, have coffee with people, do Zoom, offer you my experiences. How can I help you? Can I make an introduction for you? And I think that once you reach a certain level, you have to do that for people who look like you. You cannot just continue to grow and not pull someone with you. Whether it's 2 or 3, if you help 2 or 3, then that's 2 or 3 that may not have been helped otherwise. So if there's anybody even on this panel who would, like to meet with me, I'm always open to that, and try to do that as much as I possibly can. And I just encourage, everyone to do that, and to continue to look to our young people, to pull them along, to help them, to, if they're making a mistake, pull their coattail. If they're embarrassing themselves, or if they're, making a bad name for themselves in the community, pull their coattail and let them know. Because a lot of times young professionals don't realize their missteps, and, may need someone to pull them to the side and say, hey, you might want to, tighten up here. So that's just my 2 cents. And I will turn it over to someone else, I'm sure, who would like to add in.
Well, I think that those are all good, excellent comments. I think maybe what I'd like to see if a couple of you would share sort of what would be your specific message, though, to your white colleagues in the workplace that you think they could do differently to improve opportunities for the advancement of minorities, in the workplace. What could our white colleagues, what would you tell them to, maybe try out?
Sam, I'll answer, but I think all of us probably have that one question that from all these great questions that you had, that we're thinking like, oh man, I should have said this, or I wish I would have answered. So if you don't mind, I just want to step just a half a second back to the last question about the programs and things that we have in the area, which is great. It's just a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Because my youngest son graduated from a very large university on the East Coast. He was a journalism major, did everything right. He got experience in print, media, and print, TV, and radio throughout his time, internships and other things. When he graduated, he could not find a job. Every single employer, despite knowing people that were in my network that had some positionality in the industry, they all said you got to have at least 1 to 3 years of professional experience, which he thought his internships got him, right? And so that is what we face all of the time. And so we're launching a program here at Martin University where we're essentially converting our university to becoming an urban work college, where we are embedding apprenticeships, which are multi-year relationships and experiences for our students with major employers, so that they build that relationship and get that experience and apply what they're learning in class to the workplace and vice versa. So when they walk across that stage, they're walking across with a degree and a job offer. That is absolutely what I think is going to be critically important. We learned about this through Paul Quinn College in Dallas, Texas, who's the first urban work college. And so we're going to be the first one for non-traditional students. So that was my final commercial for Martin University. So thank you for listening. What advice would I give to our white colleagues to help, right? So I'd say it's mine is twofold. One is that the term white privilege has been a little bit of a challenging term for our white colleagues. It has suggested to them this unearned right and privilege that they have have taken advantage of. And I think that some take exception to it because they didn't ask for it. So, and they don't believe that they use it for the disadvantages of others. And they may not actively do it, but because of systemic and structural racism, it happens anyway. So my advice is that that privilege can also be used as a superpower for good, right? And I think that it's critically important for those who have that opportunity to recognize that not just your mentorship and not just your advocacy, but your sponsorship will also go a long way in helping employees of color. The second thing I would say is to understand that equality and equity are two different things, right? So a lot of times people blend them together and they assume that everybody should get the same thing, right? But if I have $1 and you have $10 and each one of us is handed $20, you have 30 and I have 21. And so because we are not starting from the same place all the time, being equity minded and realizing that we have to resolve equity before we can ever start thinking about or getting to equality is something that needs to be on the forefront of everybody's thinking. And I'll turn the rest over to my colleagues.
I can, I'll add that, for me, the one thing that I would share is that, when you get to that point of being open to diversifying, your ranks within the organization or in corporate America, that you have to be ready for this unique perspective that we're going to bring to the table. Opening the door is just the first step, right? But we are going to bring a different view, a different perspective, and you have to be ready for that. And that is going to force you to be uncomfortable. And you're going to have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because it's going to promote uncomfortable confrontation and conversation, which in the end, there's no growth if you sit in a seat of being comfortable all the time. So that's the one thing that I would offer.
And I would add to that, to our white colleagues, that those who are responsible for running our institutions, I would say, number one, it's not enough just to be committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we need you to be committed to being an anti-racist institution, right? And all that comes with that, right? Developing strategic goals for the institution to achieve becoming an anti-racist institution. And then assign a senior executive to facilitate those goals within the institution and not just some affinity group, right? And then get a third party organization to hold your institution accountable for the goals and the monitoring and evaluation and the reporting. And I would say that, corporations set the culture within that institution, right? Corporations should set the cultural competency goals and expect its employees to establish their own cultural competency goals to be a part of that institution. At Employee Indy, we're having these same conversations. We're committed to being an anti-racist institution, and we're having tough conversations about what it means for us as an institution and for us who are part of the institution to hold up institution values. And some may decide that this is not the right bus for them to be on, and that's okay, because that's this institution, and this is where we're headed in the life cycle of this institution at this point. And I think leadership has to be committed to that. And for individuals, we need individuals, our white friends, to think about, where do you interact with Black people? If the only place you interact with Black people is in your professional circle or transactional, then you really need to think hard about your relationships to Black people, right? I mean, if you have never had a Black person come into your house, if you've never been into the home, if your kids don't have any Black friends and some of this is not intentional, it's just by the way we have established ourselves as a community in terms of proximity and separation. And I remember Carolyn mentioned her experience in her hometown when the white flight moved out to another suburb. I mean, that separation has caused us not to know each other, right? So we have to be intentional to create these kinds of relationships. And so I would encourage our white friends to really seek out genuine relationship with Black people who are open and receptive. Now, don't be offended if you go to a Black person and say, hey, I want to be your friend, or show yourself friendly, and they don't reciprocate because they may be tired, all right? But find one who is open and who is receptive, a family, to establish these things, get to know them, the culture. That is the way it's going to happen. Back to relationships, seeing each other as people, genuinely one another, who are fathers and mothers and sons and daughters who want nothing more but the best for their children and their parents, just to live and be free. And once we can see each other in that way, I think we can, and that there's no threat, right? My gain is not your loss. There's more on the table for all of us to share. And when we can see that, I think that we can begin to have the kind of community we want to see.
It's really great. The thing that and I appreciate the panel, and what you've done is to try to balance, this is a roots of racism, really talking about career building. And so we've tried to give a perspective that for those minorities, Black or brown people that are joining us today, that we've given them some suggestions about career building and what they can do. But we've also given a healthy dose, I think, to our white colleagues about what they can do as well to help African Americans and other minorities groups as they try to build their careers in a white dominated society. So I really appreciate the candor that everybody has come with in communicating to both of those audiences, which is what we wanted to do today. But in closing, I'd just like to give everybody just a chance to just comment very briefly on the one thing you would like to give as a message, either to, our fellow minority professionals, or a message you'd like to give to white colleagues as we close out here today. The one thing you'd like to say to them in a sentence. So maybe we'll start with Camille.
I think I would say, as you're sitting at tables where decisions are being made, if you look around that table and everyone looks like you as a white professional, then you need to be the one to speak up and say, hey, we need some different individuals around this table. We need to make sure that we have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people of color, women. But if you look around your table and everyone looks like you, then that means that you don't have enough perspectives to be making decisions. So I think that that's a very important thing for people to look at and to consider. But then as a young Black professional, making sure that you remain top of mind so that you are considered to be at that table. Those will be my recommendations, and I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Dr. Jackson?
Yeah, I would say to our Black and brown, or to our Black colleagues, again, be willing to be uncomfortable. Every environment that you find yourself in, it's not going to be suited for you. The higher you move up, the fewer of you there are going to be, and that's just kind of the way the world is right now. But get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and invite others to engage in conversations and dialogue around things that matter to you. I've had conversations with colleagues, and the first conversation they completely disagree with me, and after about 6 conversations they're like, okay, I get it. I'm starting to see where you're going. It's not just a one-stop shop. It really takes relationships to come to opportunities of growth. And in order to hold someone accountable, you have to have a relationship. So it's important to put yourself out there, build relationships that matter, and allow people grace to grow. Right? They may not see the world like you see it, but give them the opportunity to grow. And that's what I would say to white counterparts or peers. I would echo what Camille said. If you're the only one in the room, then that if everyone in the room looks like you, then you should be the one to step up and say, hey, this, how can we consider someone else, and invite others into the conversation. Even if you have to do it informally, get their thoughts and opinions that you might take it to the table and say, hey, this is what so-and-so thought. At that point, you do it enough times, enough people do it, they're starting inviting so-and-so to that table so that they can speak for themselves because you're echoing those same sentiments.
Carolyn?
I would just say that, change is a process. We didn't get here overnight. It's not going to change overnight, but I think that now that there seems to be more of a focus on recognizing that we need significant change as it relates to diversity and inclusion. One is, if you want the change, you have to participate in the process. You have to embrace the process. You have to be open, as been said a few times, to those uncomfortable conversations and those uncomfortable moments. But again, in order for us to grow, we have to all be willing to be uncomfortable.
Denisha?
Sure. So for my Black colleagues, I would just say, be intentional about creating your own personal board of directors. So find different mentors and sponsors for different areas of your life, your profession, your personal interest, companies that you might be interested in, and then tap those individuals for help or advice for different things, and keep them updated, like Camille said, on your success and in the transitions in your life, so that they can, so that you will be on top of mind. So I'm happy to connect with anyone. Hit me up on LinkedIn, or if you're sharing our contact information, I'm happy to talk to anyone about that.
Dr. Huddleston?
Yeah, so for our Black colleagues and friends, my mother gave me some great advice long ago, and she said, never put yourself in a position where someone can tell you no for something that you really want. And so I would offer that advice to you all, that make sure that you are doing that and educating yourselves and surrounding yourselves and grabbing the resources. And once you get there, make sure you make room for somebody else. So it's not just you beating the odds, but it's us changing the odds. And then for my white colleagues, there's just one thing that is, maybe it's a personal thing for me, but please stop calling our employees of color your diverse employees, right? I mean, we all have diverse talents, we all have diverse skills, but if it's your African-American employees or your African-American female or male employees, just say that. You don't have to say diverse employees to try to compartmentalize everything into this kind of big space. And so that's just a little tidbit for you that might go a long way.
And Rodney will let you close this out.
Thank you. To our Black colleagues, I guess I would offer up, because everyone has kind of summed it up really nicely, but I would finally say, make sure that as you are engaging the workforce, that you do tend to your health, your emotional, spiritual, psychological health, because moving into these spaces do bring a lot of stress. And that stress, even for those who have been successful and move into upper and executive leadership management, there still has been a health tax to pay for that, because we are often in these hyper stressful situations all the time. So be certain to take care of yourself and provide that space for you to do your health. And to our white colleagues, I would say, please acknowledge how stressful it can be to your Black colleagues when they are the only ones in the room, on the plane, in the restaurant, in the conference. It's 1,000 people in there and there's 3 African Americans. Imagine how uncomfortable you would be if it was 1,000 Black folk and 2 or 3 whites. And we stay for the whole conference and don't find a reason to leave. So I think we need to acknowledge those realities. And finally, I would simply say a conference that I once attended where they talked about white privilege, and Dr. Huddleston talked about how controversial that statement is, and to our white friends who need to get comfortable with that, to white privilege. And what that statement said is, white privilege does not suggest that your life has been without trouble, without burdens, without trials, without hard times or difficulties. It simply says it's not been because of your race.
I'd like to thank our panelists once again, as well as thank you, our audience, for joining us tonight for this very important conversation. It is our hope that each one of you at home has learned something new and leaves the conversation inspired and ready to help create a more healthy and equitable Central Indiana for all who live here. Please know that you will receive an email with a full recording of tonight's panel, additional resources, panelists' bios, educational materials, and a link to register for next month's Understanding the Roots of Racism. Thank you again, and have a great night.